Once upon a time, in an ancient and frosty city called London, there was a lonely and bitter man named Ebenezer Scrooge. It was Christmas Eve, and the streets were filled with bright lights, carols, and children running with smiles, while the sky seemed to pour down snow like a fairy tale enchantment. The aroma of roasted chestnuts, fresh bread, and the cheerful sound of church bells created an atmosphere full of magic. For everyone, except one. Ebenezer Scrooge, with a wrinkled face and cold gaze, walked without stopping or looking around. While others hurried back to their warm homes, Scrooge headed to his office, where he worked even on Christmas. His office was dark and cold, a small room barely lit by the dim light of a candlestick. The room was filled with papers and accounting books, and a large desk where Scrooge spent hours reviewing his accounts. Scrooge allowed no lit fireplace, no decorations, nor anything that reminded him of the Christmas spirit. Scrooge was known as an extremely miserly man, someone who valued money above all else. To him, Christmas was a waste of time and resources, an excuse others used to avoid work. For Scrooge, nothing was worse than seeing people spending on gifts or festive meals, and he always grumbled at any mention of the word Christmas. He had no close family and barely spoke to his nephew Fred, the only one who visited him at this time, though he was always received with cold indifference. While Ebenezer worked, his only employee, Bob Cratchit, shivered with cold in a corner of the office, his hands numb from the icy air in the room. Bob wished he could light a fireplace, but he knew Scrooge would never allow it. Even so, Bob kept his cheerful spirit, knowing that his children and wife awaited him at home, eager to share Christmas Eve dinner with him, humble and simple though it might be. Bob barely earned enough to support his family, but that didn't take the smile from his face or the desire to be with his loved ones. Finally, when closing time came, Bob gathered the courage to ask Scrooge for Christmas Day off. Scrooge agreed, but not without reminding him he'd have to make up for the lost time. Reluctantly, Scrooge allowed Bob to go home, but felt he was granting an undeserved favor. Bob left the office happily, while Scrooge stayed a while longer, reviewing his accounts and grumbling about how unprofitable Christmas was. That night, when Scrooge finally returned home, something strange began to happen. The house was silent and cold, and he felt the air was charged with a strange sensation. Upon opening the door, a shadow quickly passed in front of him, and an unusual chill filled the room. Scrooge slowly climbed the stairs, feeling an uneasiness he had never experienced before. Suddenly, the sound of chains echoed through the house, and looking around, he saw a ghostly figure floating in the air. It was the spirit of his old partner, Jacob Marley, who had passed away many years ago. Jacob Marley was wrapped in long, heavy chains, and his face showed an expression of deep suffering. With a sad gesture, Marley warned Scrooge. He told him he must change his ways, that the path he was on would lead him to a fate similar to his, one filled with regret and eternal loneliness. Marley told him he would be visited by 3 spirits that night, and to listen to their lessons if he wanted to save his soul from a similar fate. Scrooge, still unbelieving, watched as Marley's ghost slowly faded into the air. Frightened and confused, Scrooge stayed in his room, wondering if it had all been a dream. But soon, the first spirit appeared, the ghost of Christmas past. This spirit had an almost ethereal appearance, as if made of light. Without saying a word, the spirit touched Scrooge's shoulder and took him on a journey through time. Scrooge saw his own childhood, his school days, and the moment he met his first love. He remembered the warmth and joy he felt back then, when he still believed in kindness and generosity. As they went on, the spirit showed him how, little by little, Scrooge had become a man obsessed with money, someone who had sacrificed love and friendship to accumulate wealth. He saw how he had drifted away from his family, his friends, and everything that had once been important to him. Scrooge felt a deep sadness seeing everything he had lost and left behind. When the first spirit disappeared, Scrooge returned to his room, feeling sad and regretful. But he had little time to reflect, as soon the second spirit appeared, the ghost of Christmas present. This spirit was cheerful and full of life, surrounded by a warm, golden light. Without a word, the spirit took him to different places in the city where people were celebrating Christmas. Scrooge saw families sharing dinners, friends exchanging gifts, and children laughing and playing in the streets. The spirit took him to his employee Bob Cratchit's humble home. There, around a small wooden table, the Cratchit family gathered to share a simple Christmas dinner. Bob and his wife, with their children around, included their youngest, Tiny Tim, a frail and sick child, yet full of joy and kindness. Despite their poverty, the family was happy to be together, and their hearts were full of love and hope. Scrooge was moved to see how, despite their hardships, the Cratchits celebrated Christmas with sincere joy. The spirit showed him the tenderness with which Tiny Tim was cared for by his family, and how his frailty didn't hinder his happiness. When the ghost of Christmas present vanished, Scrooge felt even sadder, but a desire to change was beginning to awaken in him. However, his journey was not yet over. Finally, the third and last spirit appeared, the ghost of Christmas yet to come. This spirit was dark and silent, surrounded by shadows and a cold mist. Without a single word, the spirit pointed to a path, and Scrooge followed, feeling a profound fear in his heart. The spirit showed him his own destiny if he did not change. Scrooge saw a solitary, neglected, and forgotten grave bearing his own name. He saw how people spoke of him with disdain, remembering him as a cruel and selfish man. He also saw the suffering of those who depended on his help, especially Bob Cratchit's family, mourning Tiny Tim's loss, because without the necessary assistance, the child hadn't survived. Terrified by what he had seen, Scrooge knelt and begged the spirit for a second chance. He promised he would change his life, abandon his greed and selfishness, and begin helping others, living in the true spirit of Christmas. With this promise, the spirit disappeared, and Scrooge found himself back in his room, alone and trembling, but filled with renewed hope. Upon waking, Scrooge realized it was still Christmas, and he had a chance to change. For the first time in many years, he smiled and felt deep joy in his heart. He left his house and began doing good deeds. He bought a large turkey and sent it to Bob Cratchit's house, generously donated to the poor, and spent time with his nephew Fred, who welcomed him with open arms. Scrooge found happiness in sharing, in giving, and in living peacefully with others. From that day on, Ebenezer Scrooge became a kind and generous man, and Christmas became his favorite time of the year. Everyone remembered him as someone who had changed and learned the true value of generosity and love. Each Christmas, Scrooge celebrated with joy, surrounded by friends and people who cared about him. And so, he lived the rest of his days, spreading kindness and joy to everyone around him, becoming a true symbol of the Christmas spirit.